Hey friends, and welcome back as we want to continue studying the great book of Romans together. And in our previous discussion of this book, the first episode or topic in this series, we spent some time in Romans 14 and 15 in order to recognize the problem that was troubling the Roman assembly, and that moved Paul to write this great letter. So there we saw that Paul addresses a church that's divided in its worship and fellowship because one group of people, the strong, look down on those who are more conscientious than they are and puts pressure on them to conform to their ways. And the conscientious group judges those, this is the group Paul calls the weak, the conscientious group, they judge those who do the things they disapprove of and view them as a threat to the health of the assembly. And we spent a lot of time focusing on that background and purpose in order to bring some needed specificity to the book of Romans. You see, Romans has often been approached from a general or a more doctrinal perspective. Philip Melanchthon referred to Romans as a compendium of Christian doctrine. And it's easy to find treatments of Romans, this is even in commentaries, that treat Romans or that look at it through the lenses of systematic theology. So chapter 1 through 3 is condemnation, and chapters 4 and 5 are justification, and on to sanctification and election and what have you. Those traditional loci or topics of systematic theology are viewed as the content of Romans. And so Romans becomes almost a general, timeless treatment of theological truths. It becomes almost an early Christian manual or textbook of systematic theology. And so it's read very generally or timelessly or abstractly. Now, just to be crystal clear, there's nothing wrong at all with those truths. In fact, those are precious truths that have brought a lot of health and renewal to Christians and the church. So we don't want to ignore those truths in any way. But nor do we want to miss the historical rootedness and the narrative framework that Paul employs in writing Romans. In other words, there's something very tangible, very real, very earthy, we might almost say, about Romans that we see when we bring in this historical background. And on top of that, there's a narrative element, a story element to Romans that brings a lot of understanding to the book as well. So we don't want to miss those perspectives. Paul teaches the truths he does, the theology, we might say. But he teaches those truths in order to meet a need, the historical problem. And he presents those truths in order to meet that need within a narrative framework. In other words, Romans tells a big story. And we'll look at that story to come in future episodes. In fact, kind of an idea that you could put over this whole series is the Bible according to Romans. If you think about the Bible as telling a grand story of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation, there is a sense in which Romans packages that whole story within one book of the Bible. And so without, of course, diminishing the importance of the other biblical books at all, you could still say that the whole message of the Bible comes through in the book of Romans. You can learn the Bible according to Romans. That's what we want to do in this series. And so we'll need all these angles, theology, history, story, in order to read Romans in all of the dimensions needed to fully appreciate and understand the book. And in fact, it's these dimensions that I'm mentioning that have been more appreciated recently in scholarship. So sometimes when folks quote the book of Romans or study the book of Romans, we don't want to ever forget the brilliant insights of a John Calvin or other reformers. Those are timeless, helpful resources but we want to add to them the scholarship that has also emerged to develop these angles that I've mentioned, history, narrative, and what have you. So essentially, by looking at the situation in Rome and trying to determine Paul's purposes in writing this letter, we can best integrate all the relevant material that leads to a rich reading of Romans. Understanding why Paul wrote this book brings more specificity to the text and gives Romans a historical grounding that aids interpretation. And so if we understand the purposes behind Romans, then we will understand the letter better. And that's what we want to do in this conversation. Develop all those purposes. Springboard from the one we looked at in the last discussion and bring in the additional purposes that enable us to appreciate Romans and all it's trying to do.